Welcome to this video tutorial. This is a complete video tutorial, so I'm going to take you right from a blank page to a finished piece. It will be hours of work all in total, so you probably don't want to sit through all of that, so I will fast forward, and it's about half an hour long, all collapsed, slightly more than that. So what we're going to be looking at today is this gemstone. So it is a very bright, lots of different colors, lots of interesting lighting. And I've done a lot of gemstone work for my Bugs and Birthstone series and wasn't sure how well it would go. And as I drew more and more of those, I had to do 12 in total because they were all the birthstones. I found I really liked doing gemstones and wanted to share sort of my process with you. So that's the end product. The materials I used, the paper is Strathmore Bristol Vellum, which is one of my, it's a vellum surface, but it's called Mixed Media. It's one of my favorite papers for colored pencil. It's got a nice tooth that holds the pencils and lets you put in a lot of layers, but isn't too rough where you get a lot of the tooth of the paper showing through, which I personally don't like that style. And then I have my trusty Faber Castell pencils. They're the Polychromos. They are my workhorse pencil. I do everything with them. They're not super expensive, but they have brilliant colors and can sharpen to nice fine points. So the first thing I do whenever I'm working on something this complicated is starting off with a grid. So here you can see me using my ruler to mark every ½ inch on my drawing, which divides my drawing into ½ inch squares. And on my reference photo, I also have lines drawn on top of it, a ½ inch apart. And what this does is it breaks a really complicated drawing into a whole lot of tiny drawings. And it helps you get better accuracy. So when I'm doing a grid, I can look at it and say, oh, that little facet of the gem goes kind of halfway through this square and it ends right in the middle. So something like a gemstone that is so complicated and doesn't flow particularly well, with a dog's face or a snake's head, you can kind of see where the rest of it's going, and artistically with your eye, it's a lot easier to kind of look at it and go, yeah, that doesn't look right. With the gemstone, to me at least, as I'm not a gemologist, it's kind of random where things are until the whole picture comes together. So I find the grid really, really helps with that. And the other thing I like about the grid is it breaks it down into sections. So especially with gemstones, it can be so overwhelming looking at what you have to draw. It's such a beautiful, complicated thing, and I love gems. I've always loved them. But looking at one, it's, how could I ever draw that? How could I ever capture that? And, you might sit down and go, okay, I'm going to do it. I've got this. And then you just sit down and you're overwhelmed and you can't get started. So using the grid can really help overcome that in any drawing, because what it does is, I'm just going to do one square. I'm just going to do this one square, and then I'm going to do the next square, and I'm going to do the next square. And all of a sudden you start putting together a drawing that's really quite extraordinary, and it can help you kind of overcome that block. So I don't always use a grid with every drawing, but with gemstones, I highly recommend it. Another thing you'll notice in this gemstone drawing is that I don't do a whole lot in terms of sketching it in pencil first. All I've done is use my grid and my guides on my reference photo to make a circle of where the gemstone actually is, and I've left the interior blank. I prefer to work this way. You might prefer to do a highly detailed sketch first, which is totally fine. Every person works differently. But I find with a gemstone, there's so many little complex things. I might occasionally put in a sketch of where the big reflections are, so that big whitish part on the left, I might sketch that in. But I tend to work better by laying down a basic layer of color. And I do this, and this is the first layer that I'm laying down right now. I do this fairly lightly so that if I make a mistake, it's pretty easy to erase and go over it again with a different color that will cover up that. So I don't do a whole lot of detailed sketches. I find gems just too complicated for that. What I do is I spend a lot of time on my first layer, and that first layer helps me block out the different areas of color and the different shapes, so that then later I can focus on layering, darkening, and adding in those fine details. And if you've watched my other videos, you know I tend to go over things about 3 times broadly. So my first layer is the basic colors, my second layer is deepening the color, and the third layer is polishing and putting in the fine details. During this first layer, I don't focus a whole lot on keeping my pencils really, really sharp. I know a lot of colored pencils artists really emphasize having razor sharp pencils, and I do that when I'm doing very fine details, especially fur. With gemstones, it's not so important because there aren't generally a lot of really fine lines. And especially in the first layer, I am going over quite lightly. And again, the reason for that is I might have to erase things, and also I want to get the basic shapes and structure of the gem pretty well down on the first layer, so that then when I'm adding in detail and color, which is really what the second layer is about, is darkening and layering to make really rich colors, I can focus on that instead of focusing on the shapes. So, you know, as you watch, you'll see a lot of fairly dull pencils and even broken off pencils, because at this point my pencil sharpener was really dull and wasn't really working. And, you know, again, you're going to have your own preferences, and I'm sure some of you really struggle with working with pencils that are not super sharp. But for me, I make do. I want to save my pencils as much as possible, so I only sharpen when I really need it, which is generally in the third layer and second layer somewhat, when I'm doing those really fine details. As I mentioned before, I really like working with a grid because it helps overcome some of that trepidation and a kind of sense of where do I start and being overwhelmed. I'm sure all of you at some point have looked at a reference photo and gone, nope, can't do that. But I find grids are a great way to break it down, and you can see as I'm working, I work square by square. So right in that shot, it's pretty much exactly halfway down the center of the gem, and I just start back at the top, and I very methodically go through each part square by square. I tend to work left to right because I'm right-handed, and that way the part I'm working on doesn't get smudged by my hand as I go across. So by breaking it down square by square, it gives you a rhythm, and I've seen some artists who like to finish a part of the portrait pretty much completely and then they'll go on to the next. So they might be working on a dog portrait and they start with the ear, they completely finish the ear, and then they move on to the other ear, and then they move on to the eyes. And that's certainly one way to work, and it's a perfectly fine way to work, but for me, I find the different layers of a piece, so the first layer where I'm laying down just the colors and the basic colors and the shapes, and then the second layer where I'm really focusing on deepening those colors, layering them and making them very rich, and then the third layer when I'm doing the fine details, they all take a different mental state. This layer takes a lot of focus on where things go. The second layer takes a lot of focus on what colors do I use. What goes in what spots has already been figured out by that time. So it's much more about, this is a browny green. What does this green work? Not really. Okay, I'll try this green. And then the third layer is all about those very, very fine details. So for me, finishing one part of a piece and then starting another part and going all the way through layer 1 to layer 3 is a lot of mental switching between those 3 states. And I find I work much better if I do all the shapes in layer 1. And I say layer 1, but each layer really has multiple layers built in. It's more of section 1. If you want to call it that, or part 1, like the title of this video. But if I can do all of part 1, then I'm in the same mindset throughout, and that helps me work faster, it helps me get in a rhythm, and then I can get in the color rhythm in layer 2, and then move to the final details, and that's my preference. It works really well for me. It may not work at all for you. That's the fun thing about art, is it doesn't really matter what anyone else does. You can get ideas from other people, but what really matters is what works for you. So the last thing I want to talk about as I finish up the first layer here is one of the things that I think is really important when you're working in gemstones. A lot of times when we're working on art, we focus a lot on gradients, we focus a lot on smooth flow. So for me, when I'm doing an animal portrait, which is my primary subject, there's a lot of flow between fur and ears, and the strokes are a lot looser. There's certainly a lot of gradients in gemstones within each facet, so you are going to want to practice sort of blending and keeping things smooth. But the important thing to remember about gemstones, especially if you're working off a blurry reference photo, is that they're hard. The facets are clear, they're crisp, they're sharp. That's how we cut gemstones. That's how they reflect light so beautifully. So if you're looking at your gemstones and the facets are a little bit, or your reference photo and your facets are a little bit blurred or sort of rounded, sometimes that's going to be what it actually looks like, but you're going to have to learn when to sharpen those edges up and really make them clear, because gemstones are a very different subject matter from a lot of what people draw. They're very polished and hard and specifically cut in a way that reflects light so amazingly. So that's what I'm going to talk about for the first layer here, and you'll have to come back for part 2 to see the second layer. And when we do that, we're going to talk a little bit more about the colors that I'm using and blending those. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you come back for part 2 of this very intricate gemstone drawing. And hopefully you enjoyed it and learned a lot. Thanks for watching.